Hello, I'm John Pickell, and today's stop along this 10-stop journey towards focusing on the theological foundations of the founding and future of the American experiment. Well, in stop 6, we're going to take a look at two very important existential choices for the American experiment. Is it a focus on its global identity, called globalism, or its national identity? And is the American experiment, the United States of America, just one among many nations, or is it exceptional? Well, we're going to begin by focusing first of all on the choice between nationalism and globalism. Here's a graphic that sort of poses the choice. Primarily, how does God view his world? And how should we view his and our world? Nationally, collection of all of the various nations of the world, or does God view his creation globally? I couldn't help but thinking he's got the whole world in his hands. Enough of that for now. All right, focusing on the nationalism or globalism choice, let's take a look at two different perspectives. First of all, Teilhard de Chardin, paleontologist and Roman Catholic priest, he said, "The age of nations has passed. Now, unless we wish to perish, we must shake off our old prejudices and build the entire earth globally," you might add. "The more scientifically I regard the world, the less I can see any possible biological future for it except in the active consciousness of its unity. The age of nations has passed." Now, the countervailing perspective, however, and Jesus came and said to his disciples, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." Now, you might say, Yeshua is embedded in the first century. Teilhard de Chardin is correct. It's passé. Nations are embarrassing structures of Homo sapiens tribalism. Let's move on to our global view, our common identity as Homo sapiens humans here on this planet Earth. Well, one way to capture the feeling, however, of that there still may be a role for nationalism in the 21st century. Here is a very important 20th century president with his perspective on the American experiment from a national perspective.
"I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country."
Then, based upon President John F. Kennedy's "ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," here are objections and rejoinders to the whole idea of American nationalism. Number one, it undermines God's will to bring peace on earth because it leads to wars. The rejoinder is that our history of the American experiment, however, is one of leading other nations, and the Second World War and many subsequent ones, leading other nations to solve problems, conflicts, and yes, even wars. White control. American nationalism is a just way for whites to still hang on to and preserve and dominate over the American culture. But my rejoinder is that the American experiment culture is not just a white culture. It is increasingly richly multicultural, and we ought to treasure that capability as long as it is founded on the American principles of individual life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because of its size in challenge number 3, American nationalism encourages U.S. dominations, holding it over, lording it over other nations. But our call is that all nations must be strong, and no one nation should dominate any other nation. Number 4, American nationalism undermines international cooperation on problems. But the rejoinder is that cooperation is really best when it's based on enlightened self-interest. And it is naive to think that Homo sapiens sapiens has wrenched out of the fabric of his being the tribal birds of a feather flock together nature. And American nationalism, as we've experienced recently, leads to tariff wars and undermines free trade. But really, tariff wars must be short-term means because they can't survive over the long term, and they're a means to long-term fair trade. All right, let's move on now to the choice between America seen as an average nation and America seen as exceptional. What is our definition that we have used in this series of American exceptionalism? As you can see in front of you, we define it as the belief and governing posture that the United States of America, even with all of its repairable flaws, still occupies an extraordinary and indispensable position on the global stage, in mankind's history, and in the eyes of God, by virtue of its founding principle and its constitutionally grounded governing framework. Principle and governing framework, the two elements that are built into the American experiment. Now, President Obama has stated quite forcefully, I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I suspect the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. It's just sort of a way to root for the hometown team. If you take a look at various images on the Google search engine, this is what you come up with when you see American exceptionalism. Greatest income inequality, highest poverty rate, greatest number of children in poverty, highest infant mortality rate, worst murder rate. That's the view of American exceptionalism. But Alexis de Tocqueville, the 1830s French philosopher who looked at the American experiment in the very early founding days of decades of the American experiment, he said, but the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults. Abraham Lincoln, reflecting upon, from his perspective, three decades after Alexis de Tocqueville, said America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. And that's why we have launched this series, because we're asking the question, is the American experiment still viable? Is it still able to hold the nation together? Or has it become passé, a pipe dream? Well, one way to focus on the meaning of American exceptionalism is to take a look at this series of videos.
The Allied force, which invaded Europe on June 6, 1944, has, with its great Russian allies and forces advancing from the south, utterly defeated the Germans by land, sea, and air. This unconditional surrender has been achieved by teamwork. Teamwork not only among all the Allies participating, but among all the services, land, sea, and air.
7 p.m. Eastern Wartime. Bob Trout reporting. The Japanese have accepted our terms fully. That's the word we've just received from the White House in Washington. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Second World War.
3 years, 8 months, 25 days after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the long war was over. VJ Day. Victory over Japan was here.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Today I say, as long as this gate is closed, as long as this scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind. In the 1950s, Khrushchev predicted, "We will bury you." But in the West today, we see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all human history. In the communist world, we see failure. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Yet. All right. Here's a way to look at the objections and rejoinders to American exceptionalism. One, it leads to sinful USA hubris, that is, exceptional pride, often producing conflicts and war. But my take is that our history is leading nations to solve problems, as we saw in World War II, for example, in conflicts and wars. The second objection to American exceptionalism, that all nations have sinned and fallen short. We're no different. Yes, we do sin. And as de Tocqueville says, our sins have a repairable element. But our nature, history, and size still make us exceptional. Number 3 objection, slavery forever tarnishes the USA's posture in the world. But my rejoinder is that the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the abolition movement were also at the founding of the American experiment, and they provided a very clear pathway to remove the scourge of slavery from the American experiment. White racism, personal and systemic, still tarnishes the USA, and therefore it can't really be an exceptional nation. My rejoinder, racial and ethnic stereotypical prejudging, unfortunately, is human and in all groups. And I have experienced it in the African American population, white, Latino, others. There is the sense of the tendency of birds of a feather to flock together and sometimes to prejudge other groups of people. The question is, does the American experiment have the principles and the governing structure to enable us to move beyond this prejudging, stereotypical approach that is unfortunately still this side of the reign of God in its entirety, still with us. Poverty and crime, unequal wealth and educational attainment, disparities. But we do have yet in the American experiment a safety net, but individual opportunity is also here. The conclusions then from this session number 6. Number 1 is mankind, in my view, is socially self-centered, competitive, and tribal. Or as I've often said, birds of a feather do indeed flock together. My second conclusion is that given mankind's nature, diffused rather than concentrated power is an appropriate check on that highly competitive nature of Homo sapiens sapiens. And that is found in the American governing structure, as we saw especially in session number 4. My third conclusion is God created mankind in his image and personally relates to mankind, not to our global home. That doesn't say be disrespectful of the global home, but he communicates not with the trees and everything in the same way that he fundamentally communicates with Homo sapiens sapiens who have been created in his image. Conclusion number 4, Yeshua the divine incarnate commands us to go and make disciples of all nations. There's still a role for nations in the vast story of God's relationship to his creation. Given mankind's nature, in my 5th conclusion, God likely prefers peaceful nationalism to pipe dream globalism. And my 6th conclusion from part 6 is that its founding principles, constitution, size, and the ability to repair its faults, its learning history, make the USA still exceptional on the global stage. Well, that's as I see it now. How do you see the fork-in-the-road existential choices? The focus on the USA as a global partner among others, or its national identity? Focus on being average or being exceptional? I'm John Piquel.